commenting and describing this, he says that David is very, very close. He doesn't know it, but David is very close to crossing a line. He's crossing that line into, I am what I am because of what I've done. I am what I am because I built God this great and beautiful temple. So yes, of course I'm successful. And on down the line, David would then be able to boast. I'm so great because way back then, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather built God that temple. And David doesn't even realize it. But he's perilously close to crossing that line. It's so dangerous because once you cross that line, it changes how you think. You begin to brag about yourself. Look at my career. I'm so successful because I've worked hard. I've been the good employee, and I am what I am because I've done it. You're materially and financially well off, and we're tempted to say, I am what I am because I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, worked hard my whole life. I deserve this. And then when things go wrong, you either get really, really angry at God. How dare you? Don't you remember what I've done for you? Don't you see all the good things that I've done for you? I've prayed, gone to church all the time, been a good person. How dare you let this happen? We get despairing. What have I done to deserve this? I must have done something terrible. If it's a works-based approach to God. Look carefully at how does God respond to this. In verses 5, really 5 through, or verses 8 through 11, God comes and he corrects David. By the way, did you notice the change in language? In verses 1 and 2, verses 1 and 3, the narrator tells us and says, after this, the king was settled into his palace. And then in verse 3, Nathan replied to the king. Now that it's God's turn to speak, starting in verse 5, it's go and tell my servant. And then again, verse 8, tell my servant David. It's like God is changing the characters a little bit here. David goes from being the great king to being the servant of God. It's like the narrator wants to correct our perspective here for us. And in verses 8 through 11, again and again, God says, I have done this. I brought David out of the pasture. I made David king over all my people. I have cut off your enemies. Again and again, God is saying to Nathan, tell David, remind David, he is what he is because of grace. David hadn't earned it. He hadn't deserved it. He hadn't worked at it. He was what he was because of grace. And so God says to David, you will not be the one to build my house. Because now I'm going to give you the lineage. I'm going to give you that dynasty. Your descendants are going to be king over Israel for the rest of eternity. But you will never be able to say it's because of what you did. That's striking. God still gives the gift. He says, you're not going to be able to think for one moment that you earned it. So your descendant, your son, would build the house, build the household. And then continuing on in verses 8 through 11, God says again, 10 things that he would do for David. I will do this. I will do this. I will do this. God is being incredibly gracious here. Incredibly good to David. But he's making sure that David is clear. You haven't earned this. This is a gift. This is a gift. That's our relationship. That's how we relate to God, isn't it? It's by grace. We are what we are by grace. You say, well, yeah, I've worked hard at my job. I've worked hard in my career, so I've risen to the top. Well, sure, but what would happen if God said you're going to be born in 10th century Tibet? All the hard work in the world wouldn't get you where you are today. See, it's all by grace. We are what we are in terms of our relationship with him by grace. God is the one who takes broken, fallen, stubborn, sinful people like us and says, I'm going to adopt you as my children. I love you that much that I will adopt you. It's not because of anything you or I have ever done. Don't think that for a moment. It's all grace. Some of you remember J.D. Eppinga, pastor in the Christian Reformed Church quite some time. For a long, long time. He passed away, I think, in 2007 or 2009, somewhere around there. One of his final columns, he wrote for the Banner, our denominational magazine. He wrote the column Cabbages and Kings. Wonderful, insightful reflections on life in general. His final column, he wrote about sort of, well, yeah, what do you say? How do you close out a career? And he described that at some point someone asked him, give an explanation for your life. What's this all about? What is Christianity all about? And his answer was simple. It's grace. It's all grace. That's true, isn't it? We are what we are by grace. God is the one who makes us what we are. So God is the one who resides among us. God is the one who redeems us. And finally, God is the King who graciously rules over us. David comes to God and he says,